And right now we've got, wow, okay, my chat box is messed up. So let me fix that real quick. And that should be, sorry about that. I tried to copy over various parameters between these two scenes, and it looks like it may have linked them instead of actually made separate instances. So we'll make this 450 and cool. And I can shrink down the webcam because now you don't really need to see me. Oh, uh-oh. Let's change. That got really messed up. Okay. Cool. Oh, other updates. So before, if you tuned in before, you probably actually saw me using this browser called Brave. And I'll admit, I should have done more homework as to the history of Brave. They recently got into a lot of trouble because it turns out their CEO used to be in charge of Mozilla and then turned out to be kind of a jerk at Mozilla and got fired and then made Brave. And apparently that jerky, sketchy behavior carried over to Brave. They were actually hard coding links so that anyone using Brave and doing anything related to crypto ended up essentially farming crypto for Brave, which is not cool because I didn't know that was happening. I don't personally do any crypto stuff, so I guess it didn't ultimately affect me too much, but just, don't really want to deal with sketchy things all that often. And it wasn't like, I felt like I was being swindled a little bit, and also like the person did turn out to be kind of a huge jerk. You can kind of Google their history if you want. I won't get too much into it here, just because it's not really my focus of this stream. But yeah, so let me keep changing this box. Hopefully this will probably mess up the other configuration, but that's fine. I'll just deal with it later. Yeah, so we are going to switch over to using Opera, and then I'll show you the actual resources I was using. So don't need to see my resume. So we were using dev.to, and it was building a Raspberry Pi cluster. So it's this article here, and I will again put it in chat just because it seems to be a good resource for people. I've seen it referenced a lot. Since the last stream, the most interesting thing I've seen was actually... whoa, I did not want to use WhatsApp. The most interesting thing since I saw from last stream is someone who actually came across the same, I guess, revelations in trying to build a Pi cluster that I did. So this speaker at Pi Ohio, building a Pi cluster. Zoom in so you can see. So Alexandria Kalika,
and I will be.
Interesting. The URL didn't change. Okay, so I will share this link in the chat too. I'm sharing this not because it necessarily provided a lot of good resources. It's kind of, honestly, it's kind of a little bit of confirmation bias. I thought it was messing things up, having so much difficulty setting up the Pi cluster because everyone said it was so easy. And it turns out it's actually not that easy. So Alexandria, in the talk, you actually have to go to the end where she summarizes stuff and then puts a bunch of links. You have to type them in manually, unfortunately. But she also discovered that previous resources dealing with the Spark cluster are kind of not great now at the time of late 2019, and then definitely not good in 2020. So what's different? Like, why was a Pi cluster so easy to build before? Well, a lot changed with Raspbian. Basically, one of the major changes, let's step back. So if you want to get a Hadoop and Spark running on your Pi cluster, this is actually kind of a technology that, like, was more useful a few years ago. Ironically, when the Pis weren't that powerful enough to run these things. But it was a way to handle distributed data and clustering. So what made things different was that Spark and Hadoop both use Java, and previous versions of Raspbian OS actually came pre-installed with Java. So now they actually don't come with it. So you have to figure out how to install it. And this was one of the major things that presented a problem. Because the build of Java that most people were using was actually the Oracle one. And Oracle previously had allowed, it was a different license. It was available via apt-get, which if you're not sure what that is, it's a package manager for Debian flavored distributions of Linux, just like Raspbian. They changed their terms so that they removed it from the apt-get. In fact, if you actually do apt-get install like Java 8 or Oracle Java 8, it will tell you that it's completely removed from the builds, but it is referenced by many packages inside. So it's a huge problem. Like you actually have to go through their website now and actually get it. It's not that hard. You basically have to make an account, an Oracle account, and then do it yourself. It is an annoyance because if you look at like, how do you install Oracle Java 8? Install Oracle Java 8 on a Raspberry Pi. I'm gonna guess you're gonna actually find like quite a few older articles. So let's look at this one from 2019. Let's look at the forum and Raspberry Pi blog. I am actually now very curious because I did not see this one on Java 8 and 11 on a Raspberry Pi, so I'm going to open that up to read later. So what I found was people were using, sudo apt, which definitely does not work anymore because it's not there. If you try to do the other thing that I saw, which was sudo update, that's not it. Yeah, these people are doing it kind of the correct way. Yeah, so I'll just sum up. What I found before was people were using like PAP. It was an alternate version. You basically added different channels to install it. And if you, which I think is actually open on the Raspbian, there's an article explaining it. Let's see. So this way that people were using, which was like a PAP alternate installation source for apt-get, that also doesn't work because because of how Oracle changed their terms of service for installing Java 8, they basically completely disabled the other way that people were doing it before. So I can try to find the source for that, but honestly, since they don't work, it's a little discouraging to actually go actually look for it. But a lot of the older sources I found were saying like, oh, hey, just do this and it should work. And of course, it doesn't anymore. And if you add that extra channel, you'll find that the GPG key doesn't work, so you can't authorize the download. And it's just a whole lot of loops, and it doesn't resolve anything. Of course, you can actually install Open Java, specifically Java 8. If you want to do Hadoop or Spark, you have to use Java 8 because the current versions of Spark and Hadoop do not go to the newest version of Java. And that's kind of why there's a little bit of a complication. So if you try to use Open Java 8 or Open JDK 8, one of the complications is the actual installation of Raspbian. So Raspberry Pis, specifically, I've got a 4. It is actually a 64-bit ARM chip. The problem is that Raspbian OS is not 64-bit. It's written with ARM v7 instructions. Actually, to 32-bit. This presented for me a lot of problems when I was trying to build things. Raspberry Pi Foundation this summer is going to actually introduce a full 64-bit operating system, but they said as it stands currently, they didn't see a reason because most of the use cases for Raspbian didn't require more than 3 gigs of RAM. But now, since the Raspberry Pi Foundation introduced an 8 gig RAM version, they're kind of like, okay, now it's time to actually do a full 64-bit OS. Yeah, so that presented problems because if you use OpenJDK 8, by default, it actually tries to install for an x86 instruction set. So when you try to install for ARM, and specifically 32-bit ARM, when you install for Hadoop, you get build errors because it isn't sure how to handle Java at that point. So I tried actually pretty hard. Like I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to an open Java on my Raspberry Pis, and I did find that you can look at. There is an architecture fork, OpenJDK 8 Arch. So OpenJDK has a separate. Where is it? OpenJDK. Let's do ARM. ARM32. They do have here it is, a project for a fork of OpenJava 8 that is a 32-bit architecture, that 32-bit instruction set that works on ARM v8, just like this Raspbian here. But this was kind of difficult to install. I had gotten it working before, like about 2 weeks ago, and then honestly, it was just a huge hassle. And I think that was part of the reason why I ended up accidentally like wiping out my bash profile. This one, it is very buggy. It is not as stable. So weirdly, the Oracle Java 8 for ARM is much more stable than the open one. I'm not sure what is different and why there had to be a separate project to actually do a 32-bit ARM instruction set for OpenJDK 8 that's completely different from Oracle, but it is what it is. Because of all the complications, honestly, I think it's just easier to use the Oracle one, and you only have to download one thing. Versus on OpenJDK, like I was looking at the repo and it looked unclear as to whether you had to install the base one and then also include this fork. The Oracle one had it all included. The other complication of doing it this way, the Java that Oracle provides was actually very unclear if it was pre-built or build from source. And the instructions that they provided were not particularly helpful. So I ended up having to dig through archives on Sun Microsystems website, like not their actual site, like actual web crawled archive.org articles explaining how to actually install the version of Java that I needed. And it turns out like the Oracle one, I believe, is pre-built. So you can just install it normally. You don't have to make or anything like that. And then once you get it working and you configure the path environment, it turns out it's kind of fine. I did manage to get Hadoop working. You can actually see, again, I should actually get OBS on here, but this is the first Pi unit that I've plugged into. It is running this Hadoop instance, and it's showing the status, and it seems fine. The issues I'm having are that it is still, because I'm using a pre-built binary of Hadoop, it does give me an error flag that I believe Andrew mentions in his article. I was hoping to not have to do his trick. So the way he gets around the error flag is he just writes in his bash profile, he just writes in the configuration for Hadoop to just ignore all the warnings and just don't display them. I personally don't think that's a good way to fix the problem. The way to fix it is to build from source, but again, because of the complications with Java, and also the fact that in order to build from source, you need to use an older version of proto buffers or protocol buffers. Uh, Whole other story. I spent a couple days trying to figure out why protocol buffers wasn't working, and there's a whole lot of stuff. And I ended up finding like a Stack Overflow article from the main author of Protocol Buffers 2, who didn't even know that the newest version is not compatible with the old version. So if you're looking at stuff that says in order to build this, you need to install Protocol Buffers 2, 100% believe that, because there are slightly different tweaks that make it so that you can't actually use code designed for Protocol Buffers 2 in Protocol Buffers 3. So yeah, a lot of discoveries in doing this thing. You know what would have made this really easy? And I think I thought about this earlier. I think I might try to Dockerize this entire thing and just make it available for people to use, because this is a lot of sweat and frustration to try to get this working. I'm glad it's actually running, but it's not entirely set yet. So I left all the errors that Andrew marked out just because I think it's good to actually be aware of them and how to fix them. In this case, it's to rebuild Hadoop from source. In going through this, I had actually a couple questions. I installed Spark with the pre-built binary, and the pre-built binary actually comes with Hadoop. So I'm actually confused as to whether I really needed to try to get Hadoop 3 running, just because it's already got Hadoop 2.7 included with the Spark build. I didn't personally try to change things or use the build of Spark that doesn't have Hadoop, because I was worried about what it would do in terms of compatibility. I couldn't really find a whole lot of stuff in my brief search explaining whether or not Hadoop 3 was fully compatible with Spark 2. So the other stuff that is good to see is on Medium, and this is also referenced by Alexandria in her talk. There was a Medium article writer, Oliver who was actually also trying to build a Spark cluster. Not as many step-by-step directions, and I've noticed that with quite a few Medium posts and technical blog posts that are kind of free. Not entirely great step-by-step, so if you're trying to learn, you kind of have to piece a bunch of stuff together, which is totally fine. It's a learning experience, and it's worth going through. Yeah, he's also building a distributed cluster with Spark, with Hadoop, and shares some thoughts and things that he had to go through. It is pretty fascinating that people are still trying to work through these things. Yeah, like his articles are written in 2017, a little bit later as well. I am really excited, I think, to try to get Docker and Kubernetes working, because those things I think are a lot more relevant now. But in terms of trying to get this stuff done, like, he doesn't get Spark running on his cluster. He just gets Hadoop. But he did manage to get Hadoop 3 going. One issue I seem to be having is when I tried to run an example from Spark on my cluster, it appears that the nodes are not talking to each other because I can start it and then the jobs actually don't get sent to execute. So in looking at the logs, I can see that it's just like Yarn just doesn't know what to do, because it just says job pending, job pending, job pending. And trying to look for the issue as to why it's not actually running the example, which I believe was like just calculating digits of pi. I believe, and this is from like Stack Overflow things I've read, I believe it's because Spark, Hadoop, and Yarn are very particular about how they set up their memory allocation. And I had basically just set up like, here's what worked on a Raspberry Pi 3 or Raspberry Pi 2, which is a lot more memory constrained than the Raspberry Pi 4 that I'm dealing with. Each of my nodes has 4 gigs of RAM, which at the time was unheard of for these little mini ARM computers. And now, because I couldn't just double the numbers from a 2 GB configuration. Apparently, there are ratios that you have to keep in order for Yarn to actually allocate everything correctly. These are all things I've learned like just in this past like week and a half, 2 weeks. So I can sort of share this resource. I'll just type it out here because it's on the cluster. I can't easily copy paste it, but let me see if I can just find it and just share it in the chat. So if you're at the similar state where I am, where you've got the cluster working, but you can't get an example working, which means you probably can't run a project on it like how I would like, then this would probably be a good read. I have been I think that thread warned that this is kind of a dry read, but that's fine. It's good to get this stuff running, I think. Yeah, if you're watching and you have any questions, like feel free to send me a message. I don't mind sharing all my experiences. I'd love to hear yours, like if you've gotten this working yourself, because it is something that I think is a good exercise and would be helpful to share your information, I guess. Let's see. All right, I have a typo in here somewhere. docs.cloudera.com/documentation/latest/topics/cdh_ig_yarn_tuning.html. Okay. Cloudera IG yarn tuning. Tuning yarn 6.3 would be really good if, not sure why that didn't work right away. Let's see. Yarn is not available at the default here. Okay, so we are on Enterprise, which is, yep, the same thing. And we want to deal with Yarn should be, Oh, I should have just looked at the tree on the side. It's cluster management, and it is under performance management. Here we go. Oh, I think they may have gotten rid of the latest thing. All right, so tuning yarn. Here we go. So this is the thing that I am now reading. It should help me get everything running. But yeah, I was told that there are actually like ratios that you have to use, and then they go through the explanation as to why, and then hopefully that will get everything running again. So currently I am chatting with a bunch of data scientists and data engineers as to like, skills I'm trying to pick up, projects I'm doing, and this thing actually comes up a lot because I figured it's kind of useful, right? Like, in a real world scenario, if you're at a company and you're dealing with a lot of data, you're going to be probably working on a distributed cluster, unlikely to be working on an individual laptop. And one person I talked to ended up, actually a few people have said like, but you have to be realistic, right? Like going through all of this to try to spin up an instance, is it worth it compared to spinning up an Amazon AWS EMR or spinning up something just on cloud? I mean, yes, how these things actually operate, but in terms of ease of use, it's probably easier to just use a cloud service, right? But even then, depending on the data source you're using, is it actually a good reason to get this thing working, right? Like maybe it's actually better, depending on the data set, to just keep it local, like on your laptop. Maybe it doesn't need to be moved into the cloud because the data is not large enough to justify doing that. Especially since this is actually something I brought up at our bootcamp where they're trying to teach us Spark and I couldn't get it working. Spark, like if you're running Spark locally and you're trying to do the same things that you would normally, then you don't really take advantage of what the performance advantages of Spark give you, right? Like you're running another fairly heavy process on your computer to do the exact same thing that you would have done without it. So if you're doing a distributed cluster, it's a game of balance, right? Like you got to figure out like, is it worth it to spin up the instance? Is it worth it to transfer all that much data over? And is it worth it to have that thing actually do a bunch of the operations you're trying to do? Possibly not, right? Like smaller sets of data, for example, Melion, I am fairly certain Melion would not benefit from being put on a distributed cluster right now. The data set's not that big. The database I'm using, I believe, is only like 200 megabytes, so that entirely fits in memory. On the other hand, if I were to look at, say, New York City transit data, I believe that is a 5 gigabyte database or a SQL database. So that wouldn't even fit in memory on a single node on here. So who knows? Like if it's that big, it would actually run on my laptop, right? But that's a lot of data to handle. Maybe it would be faster if I was trying to model to do it on the cluster, and then I could free up my computer to do other things. I'm not tethered to something. Don't have to worry about battery. Yeah, but there's a lot of questions, and it's one of those things that, like, in going for these interviews, I'm like, oh, I should actually be prepared to answer some of these questions. Like, yeah, it's really good that I figured out how to get a Spark cluster working on, some Raspberry Pis. But if that's the first thing I jump to, then I think maybe that's not a good idea, right? Personally, I'm just doing this for fun. I almost quoted One Punch Man for a second. I'm just doing this for fun because I think it's interesting skills to learn, and figured this is a good time to actually pick up a bunch of skills. And learning some of the teething pains that data engineers have to go through, I think would make me a better team player. So I'm always trying to be aware of, like, how can I help other people so that we can both get our jobs done faster, right? So I think it's still good to go through this. For personal exercises, like I actually am thinking of picking up another project where I'm dealing with weather data, and I think that would significantly benefit from a good schedule. So if I wanted to do predictions on the weather for later that evening, I could probably just set up a cron job to download a bunch of data from NOAA and store it on here, and then let that train in the morning at the prediction for later that day. So I think that's actually pretty good. I think it's good to have this ready to go, and getting some Linux administration practice, I think is, it's always helpful. I feel like I'm learning a lot about Linux, to be honest, and how much I am not a huge fan of trying to build a bunch of these applications and stuff from source. It seems to be kind of the Wild West. Definitely have a lot of appreciation for package management in Linux. It's so much easier than trying to figure out, like, oh, I downloaded this tarball. Is it source code or is it a binary? If it's a binary, is it pre-built for something that's compatible with my architecture, or is it something that I have to, did I download the right one? If it's a pre-built binary, like, where am I going to install it? How am I going to put this in my path, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really like a lot of learning experience just from this Raspberry Pi thing. So I actually really highly recommend, if you just want to mess with like somewhat abstract and surprisingly difficult computing, I would recommend just picking one up. Even if you just need something small to work with as like a toy computer, and you don't even want to do any of this complicated stuff, those things are great. And honestly, those are probably better usage of them. I did see that if you wanted to do something more complicated like what I'm doing, it may actually be better to install Ubuntu for ARM, because that is by default 64-bit, and you don't have to deal with a lot of the stuff that I was working with that was so difficult because of that 32-bit versus 64-bit issue I was having. The flip side of that is, I think Ubuntu for ARM, before it was not as efficient. I don't know how much change has happened, but Ubuntu has a very large community, so I'm going to guess that it actually has had quite a bit of optimizations to make it run faster on the lower end hardware like this. You also lose things that are more fun. So if you wanted to get, or if you wanted to use the Raspberry Pi on the side for things like robotics or even Minecraft, Raspbian has that stuff built in, but Ubuntu does not. Uh, yeah, this is a lot of stuff I'm just learning in general, and it's cool. It's fun. But yeah, so that's where I'm at. I don't really want to do a stream where I'm reading the documentation and trying to do algebra. So I think I'm actually going to end the stream here. I just want to give like an update and then give the opportunity to ask any questions as to how this thing is running, or just share my resources. So I've sent them all in the chat so far. But if you're watching this later, I don't mind if you just send me a message. My contact information should be on stream. Let me double check. And I'm always willing to talk about these things and kind of learn from each other. I think it's just good experience overall. So yeah, I'm gonna shut down the chat, or sorry, shut down my stream for now. Rehydrate. I have been working out in the evening, and it's been super hot, and I didn't bring water today, so I'm a little fried. Yeah, so I'm gonna go kind of take care of myself and then work on this stuff. And I hopefully will be back on stream Sunday doing something less technical. But who knows? It's my channel, my stream. It could just be fun to just hop on the Pi again and just work with it. But yeah, feel free to ask me any questions, and I look forward to hearing from y'all. Yeah, until next time, I guess let me change things over. I guess until next time, I'll see y'all later. And yeah, hope to hear from you.